So now let's use migrations to build up our database. So let's talk a bit about migrations. Migrations are a way to use tooling in Entity Framework to look at a database and look at the requirements of the application and build a set of code that's going to change the database from one version to another. The first time you run migrations or you use migrations, it's really to build that database. It's that version 1 of a database and database schema. And that over time you can add new migrations as you have new versions out in the field. And part of that migration strategy is it knowing its own internal version. Oh, I'm on version 1. There are migrations for version 1 to 2 and 2 to 3. And so the system will know to make those migrations for us. But we have to build them, and we can build them using code or we can build them using tooling. And I'm going to show you how to do it with tooling. Visual Studio itself doesn't run these tools on its own. They're all actually command line tools that we're going to use with ASP.NET 5 projects. Let's talk about how that works. We're going to start by going to our project JSON, and we're going to add a new dependency. And this is Entity Framework Commands. And we're going to use the latest version. And the Entity Framework Commands is the ability for us to use the DNX executor that we saw in the first module to actually execute some Entity Framework commands. So if you remember from module 1, we're actually using a web command here to execute our website running using DNX. So we're going to add a new command here for EF. And this format's pretty simple. We're going to say EF is going to be the name of the command, though you could name this anything you want. EF is conventionally what the templates will build for you. And then just the name of the assembly that this lives in, which is going to be Entity Framework.commands, just like we saw from the dependency. So what does adding this actually do? Let's go ahead and open a console window in our project. So open up command line, and I'll just do a straight old regular command. And if you remember using DNX for web to run our project, we're going to do it with EF to run some EF commands. And EF, if we just run it, will show us that we're running the Entity Framework commands and the different things that it can do. And one of the things it can do is migrations. So we're going to say migrations, and instead of showing you all these commands, you can read up on how all of this stuff works later, as I'm going to do DNX EF migrations add and then give it a name of a migration. And I'll just call this initial database. And what we can see this doing is it's saying using this context object, writing migrations, writing model snapshot, and then it says to remove this, what command we can use, EF migrations remove. But we're not going to remove it. What we'll notice here in the project now is there's a new folder called migrations, and so all it's done is generate these two classes. These two classes are going to be discoverable by Entity Framework and it will execute these in order to generate the database as well as the schema for the database. Now that we have the migrations, we're going to need to tell the context object that we want to use them. So we're going to call the database object on our context and just say ensure created. And this will create the database itself. And if any migrations need to be executed, it will execute them at the same time. Let's go over to our app controller. Let's actually set a breakpoint here in the view so we can see what happens if our database actually works. Trips is now a collection of 0. And that's actually correct because we don't have any data yet, but it does mean that we have an actual database. Let's go back to that SQL Server Object Explorer and see if we can see them. I'm going to just do a quick refresh, and there's our World DB with a table for stop and trip. Now let's use DBO as the namespace for them, as default options, and all of this is configurable when you're creating your context object. But for now, we're not going to worry about any of that. It should work in exactly the way we expect it to. In fact, if we look at the columns, we can see it's created these individual columns, including a primary key and a foreign key over to the trip in the case of stops. So it's generated all the different pieces of schema that are required to match the relationships and the data that we talked about when we created those initial entities. We don't need to be as concerned about them. But we don't have any data, so let's get some data. We'll do that next.